Howdy, folks, and thanks for tuning into the fourth episode of Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, and the second episode of our Women's History Month mini-series. I'm one of your hosts, Kirsten Belisle.
And I'm Zach Larson. Both Kirsten and I are collections managers turned wannabe IT professionals for the Fremont County Museum System, located in the heart of west central Wyoming.
Our county museum system has 3 museums in it: the Riverton Museum, where Zach works, the Fremont County Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Du Bois Museum and Wind River Historical Center, where I work.
All of our museums focus on telling the stories of early frontier life, with a mix of Native American heritage, natural history, and general regional history.
Using artifacts from our 3 museums, interviews with experts, and a load of historical research, we're here to discover, and in some cases rediscover, the quirky, the heart-wrenching, the fascinating history of Fremont County, Wyoming, and the American West.
We're coming to you from the middle of 3 mountain ranges and hundreds of stories about living in them. From the men and the women who called this rugged country home, the topics we talk about are things right outside our back doors.
Last week, we kicked off our celebration of Women's History Month with our first mini-episode of Rediscover the Winds. In that episode, we discussed why Wyoming is called the Equality State and how the movement to give women the right to vote got its start right here in Fremont County.
On this week's episode, we're exploring the life of Esther Hobart Morris and the role she played in earning women full suffrage in the territory of Wyoming.
Some background information on Esther Hobart Morris. Born in 1814, she married Artemus, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, Artemus Slack in 1841. Artemus unfortunately died soon after Esther gave birth to their son, and Esther would take her son from their East Coast home to Peru.
¿Por qué Peru?
Technically, it's not Peru like South America, it's Peru, Illinois, a little farming town in Illinois. So, because her now-deceased husband, Artemis, had bought land in Peru, that's why she went there. And like I said, it's Peru, Illinois, not Peru like the country in South America. Anyway, but because Esther was a woman and women were not allowed to inherit or own land in Illinois back in the 1840s, Esther could not claim the property. And that was probably the first really palpable experience of gender inequality Esther faced in her life. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last.
Esther eventually remarried to a man named John Morris, with whom she had twin sons. By 1868, Esther's first son and her second husband left Illinois to chase the rumor of gold in the Wyoming Territory, specifically South Pass City. They both invested in mining claims and properties until they opened a saloon to serve the town's residents.
Didn't a Mr. William Bright, the president of the Wyoming Territory Legislature and man who introduced the women's suffrage bill, also own a saloon in South Pass City?
Yes, he did.
So how many saloons were in this little town?
I mean, it's a mining town, so you can imagine libations flowing relatively freely that crime might be a bit of a problem, which in turn would require the presence of various law enforcement like the Justice of the Peace. We'll get there eventually.
If you can't do the time, I guess don't do the crime.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mr. Morris owned a saloon, and his stepson helped him there. Esther and her 2 other sons would join the first 2 men in South Pass City in spring of 1869. South Pass City was the epitome of a frontier mining town and was nearly as big as Cheyenne at the time.
Which means it was only about 2,000 people.
And Cheyenne is a bit bigger now.
Well, when South Pass City residents were leading the charge in women's suffrage, it's safe to say big changes in the world sometimes come from places you'd never expect.
And a mining town that was already on the way to a bust in the middle of western Wyoming and on the edge of the Rocky Mountains is definitely an unexpected origin for the movement for women's suffrage.
But by December of 1869, under the charge of William Bright, the Wyoming Territorial Legislature advanced a suffrage bill stating that every woman of the age of 21 years residing in this territory may, at every election, be holden under the laws thereof, cast her vote, and her rights to the elective franchise and to hold office shall be the same under the election laws of the territory as those of electors, and that this act shall take effect and be in force from and after its passage.
Woohoo! Women's suffrage in Wyoming. There you go. By 1870, Esther Hobart Morris was one of these women to take advantage of the new women's suffrage law, and Governor John Campbell appointed Esther as Justice of the Peace in South Pass City to finish out the previous Justice of the Peace's term after the man allegedly resigned in protest after the women's suffrage amendment passed.
Ha ha. So for those of us who haven't studied law, what exactly is a Justice of the Peace?
So, by my reasoning, it's more or less a fancy term for judge. They didn't have to have a formal legal education to qualify for the office, and they usually presided over misdemeanor cases or other petty criminal infractions. Esther would begin her stint as the world's first female justice of the peace on February 14th, 1870.
Esther held court over a camp of miners, gamblers, speculators, business owners, and a few prostitutes. Sounds like Judge Judy.
Yeah, I'd watch that reality television show.
Her husband John, who had a reputation as a brawler, an idler, and a drunk, added to the challenges she already faced while dealing with a rough constituency in court. According to an article published in the Laramie Daily Sentinel on October 23, 1871, Esther had her husband arrested for assault, drunken disorderly conduct, and battery.
Ouch. That's gotta put a damper on the marriage. Historical documents, including her own meticulously kept ledgers and notes, helped preserve the happenings in Esther's courtroom during her 8.5-month tenure. During her time as Justice of the Peace, Esther ruled on 26 cases, including 9 criminal cases, and none were reversed on appeal. So she did a good job.
Yeah. Esther retired from the post on December 6, 1870, when the term she was appointed to fill expired. She did not seek re-election, but an article from the Laramie Daily Sentinel on December 6, 1870 stated, Mrs. Justice Esther Morris retired from the duties of her office on Wednesday last, having on that day I'm going to read that again. Old newspaper articles are tricky.
You should see what they actually look like in person. Madness.
I'm just going to leave this in there. It'll be fun. Mrs. Justice Esther Morris retired from the duties of her office on Wednesday last, having on that day turned over her books to Justice Stillman. Mrs. Morris has filled the position with great credit to herself and retires with the good opinion of all who she has transacted any official business.
So she did A+ work, apparently, and only threw her husband to jail once, that we know of. So when the Wyoming Territory was invited to join the Union as its 44th state in 1890, many of the representatives of the other 43 states demanded that women's suffrage be revoked before Wyoming could be welcomed into the Union.
In response, and in a very Wyomingite fashion, the Wyoming legislature said, "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without the women."
Talk about sticking it to the man. That is totally Wyoming fashion. But in July 1890, Esther Hobart Morris presented the new Wyoming state flag to the governor during the statehood celebration, making Wyoming the 44th state to enter the Union and the first with its women holding the right to vote and serve in elected office. So, like I said, 44th state to be in the Union, and because they stuck to their guns, probably a little literally, they were allowed to keep the women's suffrage amendment in their state.
Yeehaw. Esther Hobart Morris and her life in South Pass also influenced modern-day officials' decision to designate a 19-mile stretch of U.S. Highway 28, starting at mile marker 44, as the Wyoming Women's Suffrage Pathway. Dedicated in May 2018, this road passes right by the state historic site of South Pass City, where entire buildings and roads related to this historic mining town were preserved and restored.
So why 19 miles? You said it started at mile marker 44 and went for 19 miles, but those seem like really random numbers.
Oh yes, for sure, but it actually has serious significance. The decision to designate 19 miles of road specifically is meant to recognize the passage of the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote across the nation. Can you guess why they chose to begin the Wyoming Women's Suffrage Pathway at mile marker 44?
I'm assuming because Wyoming was the 44th state to join the Union.
Ding ding, we have a winner. You are correct.
I would be awesome at Jeopardy! So the Wyoming Office of Tourism and their partners were quite clever with their symbolism, it would seem.
Yeah, but the celebrations didn't stop there for the Year of Wyoming Women. 2019 is the Year of Wyoming Women, and Wyoming as a whole is celebrating the 150th anniversary of women's suffrage. Wyoming's modern-day legislature proposed a joint resolution to recognize December 10th, 2019 as Wyoming Women's Suffrage Day, and in 2020, Wyoming will honor Louisa Swain, Esther Hobart Morris's contemporary, and the first woman to cast a vote in a U.S. general election on September 6, 1870.
Still, it is interesting to note that Robert Morris, one of Esther's sons, made the following astute observation. And that would be, it is a fact that all great reforms take place, not where they are most needed, but in places where opposition is weakest, and then they spread.
Necessity is the mother of invention. In this case, the necessity was needing more residents and workers and people for Wyoming to become a state of the Union.
And the invention?
Women's suffrage laws, which has in turn cemented stories and legacies like that of Esther Morris's in Wyoming's history.
And it's Wyoming histories like this one that inspired us to start this podcast. But unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of this episode.
If you like what you heard today, like us on Facebook at Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming History Podcast. We post pictures of the people, places, and things we talk about in episodes.
And if you already liked us and followed us on Facebook, thank you. Your support means the world to us. And we also have a YouTube page, a Stitcher account, and a variety of other places that you can find Rediscover the Winds on. And we hope you guys get the chance to visit our museums or attend some of our museum's upcoming events.
We have several more podcast episodes planned for you guys, including another 2 more mini episodes for the month of March, where we'll continue to discuss and celebrate women's history in Wyoming and the American West.
Thanks again for listening to this Wyoming History Podcast. I'm your host, Kirsten, from the Du Bois Museum, Wind River Historical Center.
And I'm Zach from the Riverton Museum.
And we look forward to continuing this adventure to rediscover the winds with you next time. Historical Center.
And I'm Zach from the Riverton Museum.
And we look forward to continuing this adventure to rediscover the winds with you next time.